Okay, so background information for those who weren't aware. YouTuber Shuckmeister made a video pointing out the many supposed plot holes and inconsistencies about anime and manga series JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. YouTuber Hamon Beat saw this and seethed so hard he decided to dedicate months of his life breaking down every single supposed plot hole proposed by YouTuber Shuckmeister and anyone else who dares take Hirohiko Araki's name in vain or give invalid criticism to the fifth greatest story ever told. Now, some may understand that Shuck's Araki Forgot videos are played up for jokes, but there does seem to be some genuine attempts at criticism mixed in, none of which are actually valid. Now, I could start getting into what I think of them as people, but that's not what this video is about. Perhaps if we get, say, 15 to 20 likes. This video is the list of plot holes that are indisputably in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. None of these plot holes are going to be anything that Shuckmeister said because all of them either were already debunked or were clearly jokes. Now, if you believe you can debate whether these are actually plot holes or not, which I doubt you can, head down to my Discord server in the description and we'll talk this out. Now let's get started with Phantom Blood. There are no plot holes in Phantom Blood. That's right, the first 44 chapters of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are in fact the tightest, most consistent, and most well-written story Hirohiko Araki has ever told. So let's get started with battle tendency. In Phantom Blood, Will Zeppeli mentions that he never married or had any children. This is directly contradicted by the existence of Caesar in battle tendency. At one point, Lisa reveals to Joseph that she is 50 years old. It is later revealed that she was also the newborn baby that Arena found on the cruise ship at the very end of Phantom Blood. The fact that Lisa knows exactly how old she is a plot hole, since we don't know how old the newborn baby was when Arena found her. Throughout the part, many different Pillarmen are shown, not just Cars, AC/DC, Wamu, and Santana, but there were also many others in flashbacks. However, examples of Pillar women are extremely few and far between. This is an example of sexism, which isn't as necessarily a plot hole in the story of JoJo, it's more of a plot hole in the content of Araki's character. Both Caesar and Lisa lose to the Pillarmen, whom Joseph would later beat. This is an inconsistency within the power scaling of the series, since Caesar and Lisa demonstrated themselves to be stronger than Joseph. However, both characters who demonstrated themselves to be stronger than those two eventually lost to Joseph, with relative ease, seeing that his life was only in actual danger a handful of times in each fight. From the very beginning, it's implied that battle tendency would cover more serious topics like racism, with the very first new ally character being Smokey, in a scene of him being brutalized by the police. There's also the appearance of Nazis and their impact on the plot, and finally you have the Pillarmen, who are a race of people who insist on being superior to all the humans around them and are bent on taking over the world and ascending ever higher. Despite all this, it's never actually stated that racism would be any sort of recurring theme in Part 2. Araki instead opts to continue the same boring theme of humanity, which was already explored in Phantom Blood. In fact, all parts of JoJo explore this theme at a different angle, suggesting that Araki may just simply be a hack who can't stop thinking about the exact same complex and multifaceted topic. Now let's move on to Stardust Crusaders. With enough observation, one can tell that Star Platinum is actually the spirit of Jonathan living on in Jotaro. This is inconsistent with the definition and the rules Araki would later implement for stands soon after Jonathan's returning debut. Stands are supposedly the manifestation of the user's own soul, but despite this, Jonathan is still somehow the stand of Jotaro. Early on, it's heavily implied that the world was going to have the combined powers of all the stands Jotaro and the gang faced throughout their journey to Egypt. Hamon Beat tries to claim this was just a weird headcanon, and the instance of Dio using an ability identical to Hermit Purple is actually Jonathan's stand. However, this doesn't seem to line up so well when you consider the following things. A. Jonathan himself was a stand. It was impossible for a stand to have a stand until Part 4 and afterward. B. Jonathan was not the one using the stand, it was Dio. C. Dio was also seen using Holly's stand. And most incriminatingly, D. Araki once had this to say in an interview. I originally considered making Dio stand the world capable of every stand ability in, well, the world. I was having trouble coming up with an interesting final fight, however, since I could only play cards that I had already drawn, so to speak. I eventually came up with the idea of stopping time, which was much more interesting. It wasn't until I reread Part 3 in 2007 when I realized I had already hinted at my original idea early on. In that same interview, Araki would also admit to several mistakes he made in Part 3, including that he wanted to have a fight between Jotaro and Polnareff in the Anumis arc, which the anime would eventually add in. Later in the interview, he mentioned a plot hole as well as a funny moment he had with his editor when he sent in the script for the Polnareff Vanilla Ice fight. When Fujimoto-san read the first manuscript for Polnareff's final fight, which began with Avdol dying, he looked at me and raised an eyebrow. "Why is Avdol dying this arc?" he asked. "You already killed him," he said. I blinked for a second and said, "Oh, I did?" We then both shared a laugh, and I quickly started to work on a second manuscript that had a team-up between Polnareff, Iggy, and Avdol. Unfortunately, I couldn't finish it before the deadline. Later, he suggested that I bring him back in Part 4 or 5, but I had to tell him, I don't really like bringing back dead characters. I'm not Toriyama-sensei. The full translated interview will be up on my channel soon, so subscribe so you don't miss it. Several times during Dio's mini-fights, both in Parts 1 and 3, we see that he has the ability to instantly heal injured and wounded body parts. Yet for whatever reason, during the fight with Jotaro, Dio has to ask a nearby woman to attach a body part for him. When Jonathan confronts Dio one final time, he neglects to say any last words to his adoptive brother. This seems rather out of character for Jonathan, who always had something to say to Dio every time he encountered him. Now let's move on to Diamond is Unbreakable. Starting in this part, stand names were changed to various music references. For whatever reason though, Jotaro and Joseph neglect to change their stand names to song references. Yoshikage Kira's entire shtick is all about keeping a quiet life and not sticking out in the town of Morio. The only issue with this lifestyle is that he's a white man living in Japan. Being a foreigner in an oriental country, especially in a small town, it is impossible not to stick out like a sore thumb. Kira should have always been the most hated man in Morio, notwithstanding that no one knew about his murderous actions. There are multiple characters in Part 4 who have stand abilities that are too similar to many of the stands in Part 3, including but not limited to the Hand compared to Cream, Aqua Necklace compared to Geb, Surface compared to Yellow Temperance, Harvest compared to Lovers, Okuyasu's Dad's stand compared to Holly's stand, Earth, Wind, and Fire compared to Gnome, Pearl Jam compared to Strength, and Star Platinum compared to the World. Some of the characters who were humbled after fighting Koichi were later drawn as short. For some reason, this is not kept consistent across all enemies, such as Yukako. The early chapters of Diamond is Unbreakable have absolutely no hints of Kira's existence, let alone his role as the big bad, until around the last chapter or so of the part. Many scenes that foreshadow Kira early on in the anime were added in to make up for this. There are several plot threads in Diamond is Unbreakable that lacked a satisfying conclusion, or any conclusion whatsoever. Most notably, Red Hot Chili Pepper being foreshadowed as the final villain, and the infamous Josuke going back in time to save his past self thing. In an interview, Araki explained that those two plot lines and many others planned to tie all together, but things didn't quite work out the way he thought, so he went another direction. Here's the quote in full. "The idea for Diamond is Unbreakable came to me in a dream. That morning, as soon as I woke up, I tried writing down everything I could remember about it, and planned on filling everything else in along the way with story bits I wanted to include in Part 3 but couldn't. One of those things included Red Hot Chili Pepper shooting himself with the arrow and gaining the abilities of all the stands in Morio. While planning the final fight for that one, it made me remember why I ended up changing the world in the first place. Anyway, in the dream, Chili Pepper was also going to have time-traveling powers. At one point or another, it was planned that Josuke was going to use the combining and healing ability in Crazy Diamond to combine himself, Jotaro, and Joseph into one person to become Josephame Kujo, the fusion of all the Joestars. It would be an ultimate battle through time, in which Jonathan would get involved and gain his own stand. Eventually, Josephame would make his way back to Morio and save his past self. or rather a part of his past self. I thought this was epic and the ultimate culmination of all the events of all the parts leading up to it. I didn't reveal any plans of this to anyone, not even the editors, because I wanted everyone around me to be shocked at how amazing it was. But at one point, Fujimoto-san told me it was about time for me to show him my plans for the ending. So I showed him the draft to the beautiful ending that I dreamt up. He stared at it for several seconds, then asked me what the fuck it was. He asked me where the focus of the small town feel went. He told me that it was kind of disappointing that the unique aesthetic in the series so far was being essentially abandoned halfway through. So I went and changed the direction of the ending, and I had to make everything up from chapter to chapter because my plan period was already being occupied with plans for part 5. Speaking of part 5, let's talk about part 5. At no point in the story does Jotaro make any attempt to talk to Giorno. I see this as a plot hole, seeing as his stand is Giorno's father. I find it hard to believe that Jonathan wouldn't at the very least try convincing Jotaro to let him go see his son. One could argue that he did try talking to Jotaro about it, but only off-screen. But with that line of thinking, you could say Passione had daily orgies together, but only off-screen. Or all JoJo tubers are entertaining, but only off-screen. Or Jotaro is a good father, but only off-screen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Fugo is another prime example of Araki just not knowing what he was doing. When we first get introduced to him and his stand, it is quite clear that it is going to be another lame ripoff of another stand before, Hermit Purple, Purple Haze. But then, when the fight happens, Araki tries too hard to make it more unique, and then he sends him off and implies he's going to come back later, and he just doesn't. And he tries to explain in an interview that, oh, he meant to, but he just couldn't, or whatever. Fugo's just a mess. Just a mess. Golden Wind is the part with the least characters to have an explanation as to where their stands come from. In part 3, Dio was essentially collecting stand users from all over the world, using his supernatural charisma. In part 4, Keicho, Otoishi, and Kira were all bringing about new stand users with the arrow. Without spoiling anything, there are even perfectly reasonable explanations for how the characters of parts 6, 7, and 8 get their stands. But in part 5, there just happens to be this one big Italian gang, and every single member just happens to have a crazy, unique, and interesting stand. King Crimson, while being the most consistent, the whole fact that fans have to explain how it works to other fans multiple times kind of implies that Araki doesn't give an adequate explanation himself. I mean, there's just no way that it's a case of people just not paying attention, right? He should have decided to dedicate a page or several or even a whole chapter breaking down King Crimson's ability. What's weird is that Araki has had characters with weird powers and taken a bit of extra time to explain exactly how they work, both before and since. Now it's time for anime-onlys, misogynists, and transphobes to all join hands and leave this video, because we're about to talk about Stone Ocean. What I think the weirdest and most mind-boggling Araki forgot moment is the existence of Jolene. Somehow, he went and forgot who his target audience was. Weekly Shonen Jump is a magazine for young teenage boys, and as such, nearly every series from the magazine has a young teenage boy protagonist. And for whatever reason, somehow Araki went and forgot who he was supposed to be appealing to, and had been appealing to for over a decade at that point, and gave Stone Ocean a female protagonist. Jesus Christ, how does something like that happen? Twice in this part, Araki neglects to give characters names, and instead just makes their name the same as their stand. You could argue that this isn't a plot hole, but it is extremely uncreative. Another blatant uncreative move is the design of Anasui. What's crazy about this one is that there is a more interesting design for this character in their first appearance, but then Araki was like, nah, I don't think I will, and then just made Diavolo 2. You know, the crazy thing about this character is that fans will speculate and theorize about why Anasui looked like this in the beginning, but the reality is, nobody knows, maybe not even Araki. It's something that will just remain a mystery till the end of time. One somewhat major plot device in Stone Ocean was Dio's bone. It appears to have been the first metatarsal bone, which is strange because that bone wouldn't have belonged to Dio, it would have belonged to Jonathan. But for whatever reason, every character refers to it as Dio's bone. One of the most infamous plot holes in JoJo involves Pucci stands, White Snake, Sea Moon, and Maiden Heaven. The thing about literally every other stand that had some kind of evolution or additional ability or subsidiary, so to speak, is that the naming conventions are all closely related to each other. For example, you have Killer Queen, Sheer Heart Attack, and Bites the Dust, all songs by Queen. Then you have King Crimson, the band, and Epitaph, the song by King Crimson. And then you've got Poochie stands with nicknames that are completely unrelated to each other. As I closely looked through Stone Ocean again, I found that there were a lot less plot holes than I originally thought, but it certainly doesn't make it not the worst part. This part has some of the least creative moves put out by Araki by far, from the stands to the characters to the fights to the ending. Seriously, imagine coming up with a final fight but not being able to figure out how the entire cast working together could win, so you just go ahead and make them lose, and then you can end the series and start from scratch. Speaking of starting from scratch, let's move on to Steel Ball Run. Ever since Jotaro, the very first protagonist to have a stand, each main JoJo would have a stand named after a mineral or a metal or, something that comes out of the ground. You had Star Platinum, Crazy Diamond, Gold Experience, and Stone Free. Additionally, notice how the later the JoJo part is, the less rare and valuable the material the stand is named after is. It started with Platinum, which is extremely rare, and eventually went down to Stone, which is extremely common. Furthermore, starting with part 4, the second word to every protagonist's stand name started with the letter corresponding to the number of the part. Araki would highlight this by occasionally shortening the stand names, so you'd sometimes have Crazy D, Gold E, and Stone F. Araki apparently threw away this complex and clever naming convention in part 7 by just making Johnny's stand named Tusk. What's strange is that all this sort of contributes to the strangest Araki forgot moment yet, in which he apparently forgot which stand names to give to whom. You see, in order to fulfill the first part of the naming convention, you'd have to come up with something that comes from the ground that's less valuable than stone, right? So the only candidate left would be dirt. This leads me to believe that Johnny's stand was originally supposed to be Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. You see, both in the SBR universe and outside, this name is typically shortened to D4C. When you add 4 and the C together, taking the fourth number and the third letter, you get 7, or G. Thus, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap would be shortened to Dirty G, thus fulfilling the naming scheme of the previous JoJo's. There are numerous other plot holes in Steel Ball Run. Probably. The issue is, though, that Steel Ball Run was the first JoJo part since Phantom Blood that was actually any good, and what kind of crazy person actually takes their time to look around for flaws in a story that they genuinely enjoy? Just focus on the stuff that's actually good about the story, and don't worry about anything else. This is coming from someone who reads, analyzes, and writes stories a lot. I expect a story to be perfect, but anyone would know that it's very difficult for writers like Araki to achieve such a thing. So if imperfections are hidden well enough to not be noticed while reading, I believe it may as well be perfect. And the stand name thing is the only imperfection I found while reading. This is also to say that the other plot holes are ones I encountered while reading, though in some cases further research had to be done, like with the interviews. Honestly, I don't think people should be searching so hard for plot holes, especially when a writer is doing their earnest. I mean, sure, if you spot a plot hole while reading the story, that's okay, but closely scrutinizing every single element there is with the sole intention of finding something to, I guess, mock the reader for is honestly pretty disrespectful in my opinion. So, with that being said, let's move on to JoJo. JoJo Leon is probably the JoJo part with the least real sense of direction. No matter how many new chapters come out, the story feels incomplete somehow. My greatest fear is that this feeling will continue to linger for an even more extended period of time, and that we might not get a true feeling of closure until the very end of the part. And despite people like Hamon Beat making valiant efforts to defend this set of stairs that lead to nowhere in manga form, the truth is, Araki did forget the Walleyes, sorta. He spoke about this in a recent interview commemorating JoJo Leon 100, saying the following. I first came up with the Walleyes in 2011 after predicting the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. But as time passed and the country at large began to move on from the incident, I started to look back on this plot point and I thought to myself, wow, this idea was pretty dumb, and I don't want to do it anymore. It was times like these when I miss Fujimoto-san, who would stop me whenever I came up with a bad idea, but he also stopped me when I came up with good ideas, so whatever. Anyway, I tried to introduce a bunch of other intriguing mysteries that might distract readers from the Walleyes, like I was able to do in previous parts. He laughs right here. I'm not going to fake a laugh. But one look at Twitter and Nico Nico was enough evidence to show that readers just weren't having it this time. I was frustrated and didn't know what to do with the Walleyes, and I wanted so desperately to pretend they never existed that I almost posted an announcement on the JoJo website telling people that the Walleyes was an officially dropped plot point and urging fans to stop thinking about them. But then, while washing the dishes with my wife Chami, a new idea for what to do next just came to me. So yes, do keep an eye on the Walleyes, and stay tuned for when I finally come up with an idea for how to end the story. While it's good that Araki is now able to pick up dropped plot points, the following plot points seem to have been dropped indefinitely. First, we have JoJo Leon's central theme of self-discovery, which for Josuke is literal and for Yasuho is figurative. Several times during the first few chapters, Josuke would ask himself, just who am I? And the fact that such a question has not appeared in his inner monologue box for the longest time leads one to believe that Araki no longer wishes to focus on such a theme anymore. In fact, it's been a few chapters since we've seen Yasuho at all, so it's entirely possible that Araki may have decided to write her off. Kato, in her first appearance, had an offer extended to her by Joshu to suck her titties. This setup for character drama between the two has yet to be paid off. Now, before you go thinking I'm memeing, let me explain this a little further. This scene was a metaphor for the fact that Jobin had a very close relationship with Kato as a kid. After all, she went to jail on his behalf. Now, Joshu is a character who has been all about getting shafted since the very beginning of JoJo Leon. First he had his girl stolen, then his room, and now he feels like his family might be neglecting him, and that he's sort of being taken out of the picture, so to speak. His asking to suck his mother's breast is a semi-metaphorical plea for the attention and nurturing he feels he needs. But nothing else about this potential dynamic is ever brought up again, seeming that it may not ever come to pass. One other mystery is the fact that for whatever reason the Speedwagon Foundation is in this universe, when it is pretty obvious that the Foundation only existed in the original universe, which JoJo Leon is not set in. It seems that Araki has forgotten how his own timelines are being set up, which is quite the travesty. And that just about wraps up every single plot hole in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. If you would like to debunk these ideas, feel free to talk it out in my Discord server, in which I will destroy whichever trash argument you have. Now subscribe.